Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Center of Educational Neuroscience seminar series. We're just going to give it a few more minutes for other people to join, and then we'll introduce the speaker for today. It's good to see so many names we recognize and friendly faces again from all the last weeks. So as I said, we're just giving it a few more minutes before we start because there's lots more people joining us. Okay, everyone. So again, a very warm welcome for the Center of Educational Neuroscience seminar series, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bert De Smedt, not only because he's a speaker from my home country, but also because I'm very much looking forward to his talk today, which is about my favorite subjects, being maths development. For those of you who already know Bert is an associate professor in educational neuroscience at the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences at the University of Leuven in Belgium. His primary interest is also in maths development, especially in individual differences. He uses a range of methods in looking at atypical development, but also in looking at neurocognitive mechanisms. And in 2013, he was awarded the Eric Decourt Early Career Award for the European Society for Research on Learning and Instruction. And he was also in 2014 awarded the Early Career Award of the International Mind, Brain and Education Society. So Bert, thank you very much for taking the time today to give a talk to us. And I'm looking forward to your talk on individual differences in early mathematical development, the roles of symbolic number processing and more.
Okay, thank you very much, Jo, for the very nice introduction. It's my pleasure to be in this series. I'm highly honored by it because I find it a very nice and interesting initiative. It's a great opportunity for me to be part of that. And of course, I would have loved to come to London, but I'm happy that we have the online alternative. The nice thing is that I could switch from a committee meeting up to 5 to now the seminar without having to travel by train. In the talk of today, if I find the right button in the talk of today, I will focus on the work we've been doing the last about 5 years on individual differences in children's mathematical development, particularly in their early mathematical development in the transition around between kindergarten and primary school. Here is an overview, or at least of the key points that I want to make. I will show you a range of studies where we highlight that symbolic number processing is a key predictor of individual differences in mathematics. That this symbolic number processing is more than the ability to process magnitude, and that it actually entails a variety of numerical abilities that show already large individual differences in kindergarten. I will briefly say something about gender differences, and I'm already highlighting that actually there are no gender differences in these early numerical abilities. And then towards the end of the talk, I will talk a bit more on some other studies we've been doing that go beyond number, where we focus on patterning, which is also a very intriguing and important component of children's early mathematical development. And then at the really end of the talk, I will mention some issues, some outstanding issues on other factors different from number processing that are important to understand these individual differences in mathematical development. Now, before we kick off, I would like to make a brief note on the educational context in which the data that I will present have all been collected. And I think it's important to specify this because in a lot of studies in a lot of cognitive studies are also studies in developmental cognitive neuroscience, this educational context is not always articulated or mentioned, but at least when we are studying maths development, we are studying a phenomenon that is related to education. So it's important to know this context, particularly because it varies a lot between countries, and it might explain some of the findings and the differences between studies from different countries. So Jo will know this very much, but for those of you who haven't been in Belgium or Flanders, so our system, we have what is called kindergarten, and that's non-formal education that starts at the age of 2.5 years. It's open, so anybody can attend. It is not mandatory, but most of the children are attending it. It's fully subsidized by the government, and we have typically 3 grades. That is basically grouping children 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6. The kindergarten is usually organized in terms of playful activities, so there is no formal instruction. But of course, children learn about maths, they learn about precursors of reading and things like that. There are some curricular guidelines, and they are determined at the community level, so across Flanders. Including guidelines for math. And it's important to keep in mind that these are guidelines, so schools have to aim for those goals, but they are not, it's not the case that they really need to achieve them, but most schools try to achieve those goals. Then we have primary school, and then school starts to be formal. That's in the year children turn 6 years, and we have 6 grades. Here school is mandatory. It's a more formal approach. Again, it's fully subsidized. Parents can decide which school they send their child to. And here we have curricular standards. It means that at the end of primary school, a certain range of standards need to be achieved by all children. And those standards are specified for mathematics. So this is something that you need to keep in mind when I will be discussing the different studies in this presentation. Okay, let's first start with the studies that have looked at number processing and where one of the key findings has been that symbolic number processing is an important predictor of individual differences in mathematics. And I'd like to start by presenting this meta-analysis. It's a meta-analysis we did a couple of years ago together with Michael Schneider, and that meta-analysis summarized the existing body of work on associations between numerical magnitude processing and mathematical performance. And we have had a lot of studies in the last decade, and that was also a very good reason to kind of do this meta-analysis. Now, what are we talking about? Well, this numerical magnitude processing is typically assessed by tasks that require children to understand the magnitude of quantities, and those quantities can be presented in a non-symbolic way, and that's, you can see this on the right here. Where these quantities are typically represented as dots, or we can do this with symbols, typically with digits, and that's the Arabic digits you see again on the right. And children see those two, and then they have to indicate the larger of the two. And this kind of tasks have been used many times in studies. And the key finding from those studies is that both of these tasks, they correlate with individual differences in mathematics. And it turns out that the associations for symbolic processing are significantly stronger than those associations for non-symbolic processing. So it seems that this ability to process symbols, at least the magnitude of those symbols, is a stronger predictor of individual differences in mathematical performance. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the majority of the studies that were included in that meta-analysis, they were cross-sectional. From that data, it's not entirely clear yet whether this association, which seems to be particularly prominent for symbolic processing, whether this association is also predictive. And that would be an important thing to observe, because then we can basically predict subsequent individual differences. That's a question that we have tried to address in a series of longitudinal studies, and I just present one here as an example, because the findings across these studies have been fairly consistent. This is work by a former postdoc of mine, Kieran van Binst, who followed up a number of, or at least a few cohorts of children in their mathematical development. And I'm presenting this study because it was a specific study that was focused on the transition from kindergarten to grade 1 and subsequently grade 2. And so in this study, we looked at children's performance on those two tasks. So the tasks where they had to indicate the larger of two quantities presented in a non-symbolic way, and then a similar task where they had to indicate the larger of two Arabic numerals. So how did the study look like? Well, basically we tested children at the very beginning, so in the first weeks of grade 1. So they were around 6 to 7 years old. And in the beginning of September, the first weeks of school, we administered their magnitude processing skills. So this same digit comparison and dot comparison task as I showed you before. We also administered a series of other variables that we took into account in our predictive models in order to really be able to determine the unique contribution of these magnitude processing skills on subsequent arithmetic performance. So we took into account that children enter kindergarten, or at least enter first grade, with a large body of mathematical knowledge. It was a kind of general test that assessed kindergarten's mathematical ability at the start of grade 1. And then we also took some more general factors into account, like working memory, intellectual ability, and processing speed. So that's what we did at the start, the really start of grade 1. And then in the middle of grade 1, we looked at children's arithmetic performance. We looked at their calculation skills, and we looked at the strategies they were using when they were calculating. And we were specifically interested in the use of factor retrieval, because that's the most advanced strategy that you can have to solve these or at least to solve very simple problems up to 10. So that's what we did around halfway first grade. And then we did the same again, the same task at the beginning of second grade. So the beginning of September, the next school year. So what did we find? Well, we basically found a strong effect of symbolic magnitude processing of our task where children had to compare two Arabic digits. We found that it uniquely predicted, and by uniquely I mean controlling for all these covariates that I mentioned on the previous slide. Symbolic magnitude processing uniquely predicted the accuracy of arithmetic in grade 1, the reaction time, and the retrieval frequency. So children who were better in their symbolic magnitude processing skills, they had a better accuracy, a faster reaction time, a higher retrieval frequency in the middle of grade 1. Similar findings were observed for the beginning of grade 2. We only observed it for reaction time and retrieval frequency. We didn't see it for accuracy, but keep in mind that our arithmetic task was a rather easy task. It was only calculation up to 10. And we also were able to predict development. So those children who had better symbolic magnitude processing skills, they made a stronger decrease in reaction time, and they made a stronger increase in retrieval frequency across from grade 1 to grade 2. That's for symbolic processing. We also looked at non-symbolic processing, but there the associations were either weak or they were non-significant. And once you covariate for a domain general factor, the association between non-symbolic processing and arithmetic disappeared. We also looked at working memory, and we did not find a strong effect there. It did not predict arithmetic, neither did it predict the development of arithmetic. That does not mean that working memory is not important for learning arithmetic, but at least in this study, it showed that it was not an important factor in predicting individual differences. And we could talk about this later in the Q&A section, why this might be the case. Okay. We further replicated this observation of a stronger effect of symbolic numerical magnitude processing in another series of studies. These were studies that were longitudinal at the beginning of primary school, but also at later points in primary school. We also did that in a series of specific populations, the children with dyscalculia or mathematical learning difficulties, children with genetic syndromes. And the key finding from each of these studies has been that it's particularly the symbolic magnitude processing, so our simple digit comparison task, that is basically the strongest predictor of individual differences in arithmetic and in mathematical achievement. So if this predictor is such a strong one, then it might be useful to develop measures that measure this symbolic magnitude processing. And this is what we did in this study. So we actually developed a kind of paper and pencil screening measure. It's very easy. It's just one sheet with pairs of numbers, and children have to cross out the larger number. We have a one-digit version, we have a two-digit version, and we have a control test where children have just to cross out the black figure, and that allows us to kind of control for simple processing speed or motor speed to do the task. And in this task is freely available, and in the paper we tested the reliability and validity of the task, showing that even with such a very simple measure, we can reliably and validly assess children's symbolic numerical magnitude processing skills, but also it's a measure that discriminates children with low mathematical performance from those with average and high mathematics achievement. So this is an application of our more cognitive work to a more educational context, because we specifically designed a test that was easy to use, very fast to address, that could use as or could serve as a screener to detect those who are at risk for struggling with mathematics. Now, so far, I've been ways talking about symbolic magnitude processing, predicting later arithmetic and achievement, but one can also think of the reverse association and the reverse direction. Uh, does arithmetic or learning to calculate in itself, does that impact on symbolic magnitude processing? And this is not an unexpected direction, because if you learn to calculate, if you learn that 4 plus 3 is 7, that also strengthens the idea that 7 must be greater than either 4 or 3. So there might be a bidirectional association between learning to calculate and learning to process symbolic magnitudes. And that's basically what we tested in a more recent study. Um, where we were actually able to follow up the children of the longitudinal study I showed in the beginning, that we tested at the beginning of grade 1. And we were able to follow them up until the end of primary school. And so we could basically look whether not only symbolic processing predicted arithmetic, but also whether arithmetic in the beginning of primary school predicted subsequent symbolic numerical magnitude processing. So here is what we found. This is basically a kind of similar associations as the one I've showed before. So we basically look here at the association on the x-axis between symbolic comparison at the start of primary school, and then at the y-axis to arithmetic at the end of primary school. And here we see the expected association where those two are related. The better you are at the beginning in symbolic comparison, the better you are at the end at the end of primary school in arithmetic. So far, so good. That's the classic association that we've seen before, and that has been documented in many other studies as well. But what about the reverse? What about the association between arithmetic in the beginning of primary school and symbolic comparison at the end of primary school? Given that we had those two measures beginning at the end of primary school, we could also look at this association. And here is what we found. There was also a strong association. It was even a bit stronger than the other one, between arithmetic at the beginning of primary and comparison at the end of primary school. So these two graphs suggest a kind of bidirectional association between those two abilities. We pushed this even further, and we also modeled autoregressive effects of both symbolic comparison and arithmetic in our regression models. And it turns out that there was slightly more evidence for an association going from arithmetic to symbolic processing rather than the other way around. Of course, this has implications for understanding dyscalculia or mathematical learning difficulties, because it means if there is a bidirectional or a strong reciprocal relationship between the two, it might mean that children with those difficulties are twice at risk. They're at risk of developing mathematical difficulties because they have poor symbolic skills, and we know that there is a predictive relation between that and later mathematical development. But also the other way around, they do not benefit from their arithmetic skills or their calculation development to further strengthen their symbolic magnitude processing skills. So that's, and it's a fairly similar observation as you can see in the field of reading and reading difficulties. There you also have a bidirectional association between phonological awareness and reading ability. And later in development, it is reading ability that further strengthens children's phonological skills. And there you also have a kind of double risk for children with dyslexia, because they do not benefit from their reading ability to further develop their phonological skills. Something similar might be happening in the context of mathematical learning difficulties, and this data from Kieran's study might be some first evidence for that hypothesis. Okay, I've been talking a lot on children's symbolic magnitude processing, and one can ask the question, where do or how does this symbolic magnitude processing develop? Where are the origins of this ability? Now, if we look back at the literature, one very dominant view has been that basically children learn symbols like Arabic digits or like counting words, which are mapped onto non-symbolic quantities. And it's a very unidirectional view. You first have the processing of quantity onto which symbols are mapped. And they suggest that these non-symbolic representations come first, and then symbolic representations come later, and are tightly coupled to those non-symbolic representations. Now, this view has been challenged by a series of studies, and I will present two examples from my lab, but there are many other studies around the world that have basically shown something very similar, which is that this simple mapping between non-symbolic quantities and symbolic number is maybe not so simple and maybe not so straightforward as it seems. Here is some behavioral evidence. This is again a study Kiran did in my lab, where we looked basically at the development of children's symbolic magnitude processing in the first 3 grades of primary school. And we used cluster analysis to see if we could find different developmental trajectories in the symbolic number processing. And our cluster analysis indicated three groups of children. One group that was inaccurate as well as slow, a second group that was accurate but slow in doing the task, and then we had a high performing group that was an accurate group and a fast group. And basically we had differences between the three groups in accuracy and reaction time in every grade. And the question that we were trying to answer with this study was like, where do these differences in symbolic magnitude processing come from? If there is a simple mapping between non-symbolic representations and symbolic representations, these differences should kind of lower and diminish when we take children's non-symbolic skills into account. In fact, that was not what we observed. What you can basically see here are the differences between the groups, the change in the differences between the groups when each of those variables was included in the model as a covariate. And basically what we observed is that we had large cluster differences, and they remained whenever we controlled for these covariates. And when you look into the table, covariance for non-symbolic abilities did not really change a lot in cluster differences. So that kind of challenges the idea that those symbolic representations are grounded in non-symbolic representations of quantity. I also present some brain imaging data where we basically could answer a similar question. What we did here was we presented, and this is a study that was not done in children, it was done in adults, because it was a very long study, and that's very hard to do with children in the scanner. It was a long study where we presented our participants with magnitudes, and those could be symbolic numbers or those could be dots, and we had very specific magnitudes. It was only 2, 4, 6, and 8, and basically what we aim to do is we aim to look at patterns of brain activity, and we aim to see whether we can distinguish different patterns of brain activity for those different numbers. And then we could train a computer, a classifier, on the basis of brain activity patterns to test new patterns from a different participant, for example, and to see whether the algorithm that was trained could distinguish between different magnitudes. Now, most important for our question on the relation between symbolic and non-symbolic number is the graph here completely on the right. So what we try to do there is the following. We try to test the computer on, or we train the computer on brain activity patterns for symbols. And then we test if the computer can recognize the activity patterns for the dots. Now, if there is a strong mapping between symbols and quantities, then the computer should be able to learn to recognize those brain activity patterns for dots if we train the computer in symbols. The opposite we could do for training the computer in distinguishing between dots and then using the symbols to test if the computer has learned the difference. Now, if there's a tight coupling between the two, the computer should be able to do that. If there is not a tight coupling between the two, then the computer will fail. And actually, the last observation is basically what we observed. Uh, it, it didn't work to train a computer on dots and then recognize symbols, and vice versa. If we trained the computer on symbols, it did not recognize differences between the dots. So that observation basically suggests that there is not a strong connection or strong coupling between symbols and quantities, at least not in terms of brain activity patterns. Okay, so far I've been talking about symbolic number processing, and I've mainly restricted my talk to magnitude, but actually there is much more in symbolic number processing. There are much more numerical abilities implicated in that, and those abilities show already large individual differences in kindergarten. And this is actually related to the idea that symbolic processing has, of course, many dimensions, has many shades. It's not only about quantity and magnitude, but symbolic number also represent order. They also represent place value, and there's also syntax that children need to learn in order to represent symbolic number. And so here the picture might be fairly easy, like being quantities, counting words and Arabic numerals. But if we go to larger numbers, there is, of course, if we think about place value, for example, the 4 or the 1 means symbol 1 means in 1 something different than the symbol 1 in 14. And actually, there are these very different aspects of symbolic number processing that need to become integrated. And over the last years, there's been more and more studies, at least in the developmental literature, that is paying attention to those different dimensions of symbolic number processing. And actually, if we look already before children go to first grade, before formal schooling, in each of these dimensions, there are already large individual differences. And I think an important question that we need to answer, and that many labs currently are trying to figure out, is how are these different dimensions of symbolic processing, how are these becoming gradually connected, and what are different developmental trajectories in learning these different aspects of symbolic processing. And I will present you some data from a large-scale project we've been doing over the last nearly 4 years, where we basically followed a large sample of children, and they came from a variety of SES backgrounds, and we followed them from the what we call second year of kindergarten up to elementary school. And if all goes well, we should have another round of data collection after the Easter break, and the children are now in their third grade. So in this study, we did an assessment of children's numerical abilities, also administered some cognitive skills, and this allowed us to understand how different symbolic number abilities are correlated with each other and how they predict subsequent differences in mathematical achievement. I will be mainly focusing on numerical abilities and mathematics achievement. I will say something later on about patterning too, but the project was much bigger than those two components. We also aim to look at more complex mathematical abilities, even at this early age, from the age of 4 to 5, focusing on estimation, on proportions, and on the understanding of probability. Here is some examples of the different numerical tasks that we used. So we looked at children's counting. Of course, we looked at their comparison skills. We also looked at their ability to recognize numbers, not only single-digit numbers, but also multi-digit numbers. And this is a very interesting task, as I will later show, because a lot of 4 to 5-year-olds, they know already a lot of numbers that go beyond 10. We also had a number order task. So in that task, children saw a number and they had to indicate which number comes before or which number comes after that number. And we had a calculation task. One question that we tried to answer is the extent to which these early numerical skills in kindergarten predicted later mathematics achievement in grade 1. And this mathematics achievement was basically measured by a general test that included curriculum-based mathematical abilities. It included calculation, but also measurement, as well as geometry. Okay, so here I'm showing you the different numerical abilities, and then we look at the correlations between those numerical abilities and subsequent mathematics achievement. And we control our correlations on the one hand for verbal ability, on the other hand for spatial ability. So all the correlations you will see are partial correlations controlled for either verbal ability or spatial ability. And what we basically see is that these numerical abilities in the second year of kindergarten are all predictive of later mathematics achievement. And if we put that into a regression model, it turns out that the ability to count objects, to order numbers, and to compare dots are the most predictive variables in predicting subsequent performance. If we do the same exercise for the third year of kindergarten, so that's the year before they transition to first grade, again, all those abilities are predictive. But if we put them together into a model, it turns out that calculation, the ability to identify numerals, and the ability to order numbers are the most predictive variables. Okay, one question that we often get, especially from teachers, is whether there are any gender differences in these abilities. We also check that in our sample. And basically what we are trying to do here is we are using Bayesian analyses to find out whether there is more evidence for equality, for no gender differences, versus whether there is evidence for a gender difference. And we are using these Bayesian statistics because they allow us to quantify evidence for one or the other hypothesis. And in the graphs I will show you, I will basically use two colors. The orange color is indicating evidence for equality. So that's basically evidence in favor of the null hypothesis of no differences. The blue is indicating evidence for a difference between boys and girls. If we look at the second year of kindergarten, so the 4 to 5-year-olds, this is basically what we found. Across actually all of the abilities that we tested, there is substantially more evidence for equality. So it's all orange that that you can see in this graph. So evidence for equality, that is, the data are much more likely indicating that there is no difference between boys and girls in these different numerical abilities under study. The same is true for the third year of kindergarten, except for the identification of numerals, where there seems to be an advantage for boys as compared to to girls. But it's only on that variable that we observed a difference. All the others, there was very clear evidence for equality. And then if we looked at the maths achievement in grade 1, again, substantial evidence for equality between boys and girls, and so evidence in favor of the null hypothesis of no gender differences. Okay, in the last part of the talk, I will shift the focus a bit away from number to other competencies that might be relevant in children's early mathematical development. And I will focus a bit more on children's understanding of patterns or sequences. And the reason why I'm focusing on this is that if we look at the definition of mathematics, mathematics as a science, it has been defined as a science of patterns. And it has been emphasized that this patterning is something very critical to mathematics, not only in mathematics as a science, but also in the broader math educational literature, where there has been a large emphasis on children's understanding of patterning. And patterning is considered to be something that is very relevant, or at least a very relevant component of mathematical development, because this understanding of sequences, this understanding of a unit that is repeating or that is growing, has been found to be a major important step to understand algebra, to understand mathematical functions. So here's some data we collected a couple of years ago. It was Kelsey McKay who was doing that at that time as a master's student in my lab. And we looked at children's different patterning skills in different dimensions. So here there were number patterns, letter patterns, time patterns, rotation patterns, and children had to find the missing element in the sequence. And it turned out, and this was data collected in grade 1 and 2 of primary school, it turned out that these patterning skills were unique predictors of children's calculation. And by unique, I mean taking into account other cognitive abilities like IQ, like working memory. There was some degree of specificity in the patterning, giving some stronger relations for number and time, but this difference was really small. Now this is primary school. In our larger project, we also investigated this at the level of kindergarten. And there we looked at basically two types of patterning: repeating patterning, where you have a unit that is repeating, and children have to predict what comes next, for example. We also looked at growing patterns, where there is growth, there's an increase or a decrease in the pattern, and children have to either predict that or they have to copy a pattern that they see with other materials, and so on. What we found in that study was that those measures of patterning, both of repeating and growing, they were uniquely correlated with mathematical performance, not only cross-sectionally, but also longitudinally. And so we had measures of patterning in the second year of kindergarten, in the third year of kindergarten, and both of them, they predicted subsequent mathematics achievement in grade 1. Now we also looked at the interrelation between those patterning abilities and early numerical abilities, because they are not only two components of mathematical development, but they might also be interrelated. And our longitudinal study basically allowed us to look at those interrelationships and to look at the extent to which either patterning is predicting numerical ability or vice versa, or whether this association is kind of reciprocal. And this is very recent data that we basically just published. We have here our data from our big samples, so about 400 children that we followed longitudinally. And the key message from this figure is that basically these patterning abilities and numerical abilities are interrelated. They are predicting each other, and it's important to take into account that the bidirectional associations are stronger in preschool as compared to first grade, because in the transition from preschool to first grade, it turns out that there is more a relation from patterning to numerical abilities than the other way around. Also keep in mind that this is a cross-legged model where we control for children's spatial skills and their spatial ability, because all the patterns were spatial and we had this control in our model.
Just
Okay.
your 3 minutes warning as requested.
Okay, so I will end with some outstanding issues that there is I mean, these are some studies that are related to what I have shown, but that are pointing to other sources that explain individual differences. So it's not only about number and not only about patterning. What I did not discuss, and I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A section, is of course that there are also domain general factors that might determine these individual differences in children's development, working memory, spatial cognition, and metacognition. An important question or outstanding question there is the extent to which they interact with the domain-specific processes that I discussed before. Another outstanding issue is the overlap or the relation between different academic abilities. Maths, it's not the only thing that children learn at school. There's also other abilities like learning to read that children have to master. And this is a study, I won't go into the details, but this is a study where we looked at cross-domain associations of correlates of reading and maths and reading and arithmetic. And so not only correlates of arithmetic are important for learning arithmetic, but also correlates of reading are predictive of subsequent arithmetic and vice versa. In addition to abilities, there's also a line of research where children that has looked at the interest of children, how they attend to number and to pattern in their environment. And this is these are kind of open tasks where you ask children to describe a picture or to build a tower. And some children will attend more to number and some will attend more to pattern. And it turns out that this attention correlates with individual differences. Well, this is an important observation, but there is more work needed to figure out what is really the chicken and the egg, whether children who are more attentive to number get more support in this and get more activities from parents, from their teachers, or vice versa. Okay, I will running out of time, but I will basically present the same conclusions as I started with in the beginning. I've highlighted that symbolic number processing is a key predictor of individual differences, that this symbolic number processing is more than magnitude, and that there are a wide range of symbolic skills that already have large individual differences before children go to formal school, that there are no gender differences in these early numerical abilities, that patterning is something interesting, important component of mathematical skill that we need to consider, and that in addition to those domain-specific predictors of performance, there are of course other determinants of individual differences in children with mathematical development. I'd like to end by thanking my great lab and some great collaborators that have worked together with us in these different studies, and some people that gave me some money to do all this stuff. And I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm more than happy to take any questions on this work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bert. That's an absolutely great talk, and we already have some questions in the chat. But as you know, we take questions either in the chat, but also if you want to ask in person, feel free to unmute yourself. So first question is from Rebecca Gordon asking, what working memory measures have you used when working memory was not a unique predictor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in that specific study, we had a measure of spatial working memory. So it was a Corsi block task where children had to repeat a sequence of blocks that were tapped. And we also had a more verbal task, which was an updating task where it was a listening span task where children received sentences that were either correct or incorrect, and they had to indicate whether the sentence was correct or not. And then they had to keep in mind the last word of the sentence, and they had then to repeat that at the end. So these were all span tasks that we used in those two dimensions. It's important to keep in mind that in those studies, we deliberately used working memory tasks that did not include any number or numerical information.
Thanks for that. Yes, another question for, or maybe some food for thought from Gaia around what your thoughts would be around the bidirectional relationships between processes. So, for example, patterns and symbols, but also with domain general processes and why these relationships might change over time. And I had a very similar question because we're in my lab, we're working on those domain general, domain specific relationships. And I mean, I would like to expand on Gaia's question to see also how that might link to how we measure mathematical abilities.
Yeah, I think the idea of bidirectional associations is a very important one. I'm happy to see that many studies are now considering this possibility, because I think in the past a lot of studies have thought as these domain general processing being more causal maybe than the more specific processes. And of course, the causality is not dependent on the type of process that you study, but on the design that you use in order to understand these relationships. In our studies, the one I've shown on number and arithmetic, that was just a first step in that direction. I think you can also do the same, and I think there might exist some work on this with working memory, where you basically, I think it's I'm just thinking about the name of the study. It's a longitudinal study where they measured working memory and mathematical performance at different time points. And a key finding of the study is that there is a bidirectional association between the domain general process and the mathematical process, and indicating that learning to calculate doing maths is also improving your working memory. I'm not sure about the age at which that study observed that bidirectional association, but I think it's an important possibility that future works should really focus on, because if you think of it functionally, like doing maths in class is basically a working memory exercise. It's basically training your working memory, and I would not be surprised if that would improve your working memory, as well as other domain general processes, I think.
Yeah, I was also wondering what your thoughts are around that. Would that then be predicting how things change over time, or what's driving the fact that these bidirectional relationships might change?
And could you specify what you mean?
Yeah, so this
with
from
with the change of bidirectional association?
No, I mean, sorry, I'm really simplistically, for example, not simplistically because it's very interesting, but even just keeping it to the domain specific. I was in the examples that you were giving. You gave some really interesting examples of bidirectional relationships. I forgot whether it was with symbols and patterns or some of the other numerically relevant processes. that were strongly bidirectional, but changed over time in the sense that they became more unidirectional.
Yep.
I mean, do we have a very good cognitive account of why that might be happening? Or is it something that depends on how we measure those skills and how important those skills are at those points in time?
Yeah,
I don't know.
No. Now I completely get the question.
So that might apply in the context of domain general and domain specific relationships too. But that's an example in your talk about domain specific, domain specific.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. So with the patterning, there's a couple of things there. One is with those repeating and growing patterns. Of course, finding how if you have good numerical skills, you find more easily how the pattern works. If there's a growth in the pattern or decrease in the pattern, that can be boosted by your numerical skills. The other way around is like there's a lot of patterns in let's say counting or in number symbols, like you have digits from 1 to 9, and then they repeat again from 10 to 19, and they repeat again from 20 to 29, and so on and so on. So that's the kind of functional link that you can identify between the two. And so that's a kind of cognitive account of this bidirectionality. The question about the change, why we observed in this transition from, or at least in these younger years in kindergarten, this bidirectionality, and not in the transition from grade 1, from kindergarten to grade 1, that is in that context is a measurement question, because in that study, I think our measures of numerical performance were not or were too easy probably to find the relationship in the other direction. So I think the measurement is a very critical component there to take into account. And I guess that also applies when you're looking at interactions between domain specific and between domain general abilities.
Absolutely. I know we're getting close to 5 o'clock, but I would like, if you've got another few minutes, Bert, to ask 2 more questions, if that's okay. One is from Nora Newcomb, asking around, do you think the work is mature enough at this stage to identify targets for intervention, enrichment, assessment, or etc.?
Well, I think at least when it comes to numerical abilities, I think an important implication is that in kindergarten or before the start of formal schooling, it's important to focus on those variety of numerical abilities, not only on magnitude but also on order. On understanding symbols and things like that. So I think in terms of diversity of activities, that I would think that's already an important message, not only to teachers in kindergarten, but also to parents at home. As for the patterning, we have some intervention work running at the moment, and I think that will be critical to see the importance of whether stimulating those patterns is having an effect on not only patterning ability, but also on numerical ability and later mathematics achievement. I'm not sure we are there yet. We are running these kind of studies, and I hope to be able to present the outcomes at some later point in time. I do know that at least in Flanders, a lot of teachers in kindergartens work with patterns, but the patterns that they use, they are fairly easy and simple. And so one question that we also trying to answer in this intervention work is whether working with more complex patterns like this growth patterns or these decrease patterns is beneficial, or is even more interesting for stimulating mathematical development than just working with this kind of repeating patterns.
Thank you. That's a very nice answer. But Diana has a question, but I don't know whether you can unmute yourself, Diana, to ask it, because I'm not sure I understand your question correctly. So the question is around if the algorithm was unable to distinguish the relationships between low and high attainers processing of symbolic and non-symbolic representations, could that data be used to identify the differences in processing symbols between low and high attainers?
I'm assuming this is referring to the brain imaging work.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
So what we the only test we did was so we trained the computer to identify differences between patterns of brain activity between symbolic and non-symbolic representation. We did not use it, or we did not train it to distinguish between individuals. So it was I mean that would have required a huge sample of individuals that differed in their mathematical performance, and so the test was merely on finding the difference between symbols and non-symbolic representation. And so that's the reason why we collected a lot of data within one participant, but the size of the sample was not big enough to do that between participants. So that data are definitely too small to identify differences between high and low attainers. Would that be possible? That's an interesting empirical question. But that would require a large sample of individuals that would be assessed, and then that would be used as the input for the algorithm to learn the difference.
Yeah. There was an interesting question from Caroline Witten asking around, what's the role of automaticity in the directionality that you've observed?
Well, I think there's a key role there, because when we talk about when I'm presenting data on symbolic processing, and when it's measurement of that symbolic processing in primary school, especially in the later years, it's always about fluency and speed with which children perform a particular task. So I think, yes, automaticity is key in this process.
Yeah. I know there's a few more questions, but also a lot of people are thanking you and are having to leave the meeting. I think seeing that we're at 5 past, and that it's already 6:05 in Belgium. So I'd like to thank you again on behalf of everybody who's been listening, and on behalf of the Centre of Educational Neuroscience for your talk today. So the Centre of Educational Neuroscience for your talk today. Yes. It's also time for me to call it a date. So thank you all very much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks.
So we're still recording.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Bert, for reminding me.